Hello, everyone, and very glad that you could all join us today. I am Eli Leland, CTO and co-founder at Voltaic, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on the topic of overcoming challenges in scaling up battery manufacturing. It's going to be an exciting and information-filled session. So first, some housekeeping notes as we get started. We do welcome and encourage participation from our audience today. So please do submit your questions through the Q&A function of your Zoom app. Please note that participant chat is disabled for this webinar, but we do welcome your questions and encourage them through the Q&A function. So please do use Q&A to submit your questions. Today, our featured panelist is Kenzo Nagai. Kenzo brings nearly 3 decades of experience from early prototypes to mass production at some of the leading companies in the battery space, including Tesla, Apple, E1 Mali Energy, and Northvolt, and among others. Kenzo is also a member of Voltaic's advisory board and is engaging with our customers as well to share his expertise through our EBIX consulting practice. So we welcome you to email us at info@voltaic.com if you'd like to learn more about that. On today's panel, Kenzo is joined by my co-founder and Voltaic CEO, Tal Scholklopper. Tal has also been working on electrification technologies for over 20 years with extensive hands-on experience developing and commercializing fuel cells and grid storage batteries before starting Voltaic with me in 2012. So with that, we'll get started. I guess I'll turn it over to Kenzo to begin. So I'll just very briefly through the agenda. We will be Kenzo will be presenting some material on battery manufacturing, basically to the topic of today's program, how you get started, what it's really like to scale up production of battery technology to a fairly good degree of detail. And then we'll break from the slides and we'll talk through conversationally about myths versus realities in battery cell manufacturing. And then some thoughts on looking ahead for the industry, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So again, please do use that Q&A function to submit your questions. And with that, I will turn it over to Kenzo to begin his presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Eli. Hello, everybody. I'll try to do my best in explaining what is cell manufacturing and some of the challenges and timelines. So cell manufacturing to me is a series of engineering problems. What I mean by that is the product itself is an electrochemical problem, different materials and potentials and environmental challenges in the use of those materials. And then manufacturing those materials is a process and mechanical engineering problem with process parameters that don't necessarily carry over from prototyping and pilot to mass production. And ultimately, there's a lot of high-speed web converting, so roll-to-roll processes that are not easy, and what I call Swiss watchmaking assembly precision at hundreds of parts per minute, and millimeter or micron level accuracy required. And when you fail at the manufacturing portion of it, it becomes a thermal engineering problem. Whether it's regulatory or in the field, cells can and will burn, and the root causing of that failure is very difficult and time-consuming, and the result can be up to a factory burning down. So I say that lithium-ion cell manufacturing is always more difficult than anticipated, more expensive than always estimated, and then takes longer than scheduled. So we'll talk more of those throughout the presentation. So in the failure of manufacturing, you get thermal events. And if you start with fire, what is the acceptable rate of fire, or a cell that may eventually burn a car or burn your facility down? 2 nines or 0.01% reject rate might seem reasonable, but if you take a gigafactory that produces 5 million cells a day at 0.01% for fire, that's 168,000 fires per year. At 6 nines, it's 17 fires per year. So none of which seems, acceptable as far as failure rate. So I guess we're supposed to read this post. There's no such thing as a perfect battery on your spare time. So extreme rigor, extreme care and rigor at every step of design decision making, taking account of expert opinion and guidance, and allowing the proper amount of time to develop and sequence your product maturity, and not being influenced by schedule. I mean, by this I mean customer, and not a whole lot about cost, and definitely not about output. So what does that mean in prototyping as far as what you have to do and how long it takes? I won't read all of these. It's just an example of 3 buckets of just the prototyping aspect of what the things you have to do and how long they might take. So you see here, it's easily a 3-year endeavor from a paper study to having a cell that's designed, frozen, and ready to go to the next stage, which I'm calling pilot. So what are the purposes of those prototyping and pilot and mass production? For prototyping, to me, it's designing this, obviously the cell, and selecting the materials and trying to get early customer feedback on performance. And at pilot level, in my opinion, it's to inform mass production equipment design. You're getting equipment that has a lot of knobs and levers, so you can figure out the process conditions to inform what your mass production systems might look like. And then in mass production, always, I think the purpose and the goal of any business is to make money. Having said that, this is just an example, more sort of a cylindrical project of what prototyping means as far as pieces per day and what you're trying to do and what the machine looks or the equipment looks like. Again, so this is a sort of a cylindrical look at things, but these are the types of numbers I think you should be producing at each of these maturity stages, and the elements of those equipment. Keys to success. So for prototyping, what we're calling 18 to 36 months, I think the design freeze is the major key to get out of prototyping. What you achieve in prototyping, the level of maturity there will carry over to pilot. And that pilot is where you start developing sort of batching systems and traceability and your QC elements, and then providing reasonable numbers to customers and for regulatory testing, for early regulatory testing. And then mass production, of course, is the takeaway for me here is the instilling the fear of batteries and extreme focus on quality. We talked about earlier what it means to have 6 nines for your reject rate. And if you don't get that right, it can mean a fire and pain to the business itself and the industry altogether. So considering all these stages, it's a 3 to 5 year endeavor from thinking about making a prototype to steady state output at mass production. I think most of us are aware of the various steps in the mass production of cell manufacturing. To me, it's broken down into almost three different facilities, which I'll show a little bit later. There's an electrode portion of it, an assembly portion of it, and a finishing and formation. Each of those processes has its own, what I have here is OEE, is overall equipment efficiency or effectiveness. And to get that balance correct, and to have that balance mean no stoppages throughout your factory, which is the biggest sort of operational cost. You have to have width buffers or work in progress buffers. I think factory designs are trying to limit buffers, which I understand, but at the same time, the uptime of all this equipment certainly right now relies on buffers, the way the processes are broken down. So I've seen certain designs that limit buffers and have the factory balance bottlenecked in the wrong place by design, and factory stoppages are the result. So just a quick explanation on OEE. Everyone has a little bit different calculation. So the point here is mostly that availability, performance, and yield all total to become your OEE. So when you buy a 100 part per minute piece of machinery, factoring OEE gives you an 85% OEE gives you 85 parts per minute. So when you're doing your factory design, the subsequent processes should not be depending on 100 parts per minute. You should be depending on or realizing that 85 is what you're going to expect. If it is expecting 100 parts per minute, you are going to have a starvation occurrence scenario, and therefore your factory will shut down. So it's very important to get the equipment count and the best estimations of OEE factored into your facility design, so it doesn't stop production or lack of product moving through. So I get asked a lot about what is a mass production timeline, and it's a very difficult question, but each piece of equipment typically requires its own qualification program before it's accepted for use. And how you think about that is I've broken it down into three sort of timelines: is the startup and the debugging, optimizing. So those are pretty long durations, and nobody likes to see that, but that is the reality. With, like I said, each piece of equipment, the whole factory doesn't get startup and debugged and optimized all at the same time. It's step by step by step. Some of it can happen in parallel, but a lot of these pieces of equipment require material usage and scrap rates that need to support the debugging, and that's where you run into sort of timelines and failures and delays. I see that a lot with the newcomers to the industry, where they don't have another electrode factory to supply materials to do all the debugging and the optimizing and the training. And that is definitely a pain point in industry right now. We talked about cell manufacturing being three separate factories. Again, electrode, winding, assembly, and finishing formation. Each of those are very different disciplines. Electrode is a converting process where you're coating, you're pressing, you're slicing, and then winding and assembly is a parts assembly process. A lot of mechatronics, and finishing formations is power electronics and storage at very precise temperatures to execute on the aging. So a lot of factors go into designing a cell manufacturing facility. All this equipment does not come from one supplier, so to manage that procurement is a mission in itself. Excuse me, there's no turnkey equipment supplier that is, top tier to me. And all those contribute to a very difficult design and implementation of all these elements that are very unique to cell manufacturing, and it hasn't been done at the scale that is trying to be done right now. So there's a very there's a lack of, I would say, expertise on what it is that goes into a cell manufacturing facility, and a lack of sort of the people who really understand what those are and why they matter. So, as I said before, cell manufacturing is always more difficult than anticipated and higher cost than estimated and takes longer than scheduled.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Kenzo. So we'll move on to the myths versus realities in just a moment, but there's just a couple, as you were presenting your material, a couple of questions came up that I'd love to kind of dig into. So clearly this is, it's this task of overwhelming magnitude almost when you consider all the different stages, all the things that have to come together, and then how ultimately how optimized and perfected your process has to be in order to produce viable cells at a high enough yield and throughput to make money on them. It almost seems miraculous that anyone gets it done at all, and not so surprising that as we've seen, industry leaders can take on the order of 4 years or so to really get a gigafactory up and running and profitable. With all that said, it's so overwhelming, and part of what we promised our audiences is some guidelines to this. So let's suppose a company is ready for mass production, or ready to embark on ready to for mass production. What is the of all those different things and different considerations, what are the first couple things that you have to do? Because there's so many different tasks, right? There's the real estate, there's the building, there's all the equipment, there's all your material supplies, there's hiring, like kind of just like, can you walk through like a rough order of operations?
Yeah, I think from my experience, having a clear focus on the product. The factory is, the element that makes that product on mass scale. So the product has to be, like you said, ready. What does that mean? The stages of sort of the prototyping and piloting that I mentioned are, to me, are super important to make sure you go through those and understand the product nuances and the manufacturability of that product before you start saying how much footprint do you need for a 50 gigawatt hour version of what this product manufacturing looks like. So certainly I think the product designers and the product engineers should have a big say and carries a lot of the weight at the beginning stages and throughout the whole process to be involved still in the factory's design and some of the process functional rooms that go into it. So to answer your question, I think number one is the product focus, product maturity.
Yeah, I think just to dive in there a little bit, it's one of those things that everyone, because of the lead times for getting the equipment, and they try to like rush a step forward and have a rough sense of my tolerances. Let me just get equipment that broadly meets that, and you end up with a very expensive challenge later on of really trying to dial in and figure out what are those tolerances, what are at the edges, how quickly can you coat this, how uniform does the coat have to be, all those little boundaries of that manufacturability that go into manufacturability. The sooner you can start dialing those in, the better it's going to be overall.
Awesome. And there was another concept, Kenzo, that you covered in your material that I'd love to just dig into a little more. I think for those of us who have been working in this field for a little while, it's a little bit more intuitive, but specifically the work in process buffer when planning your factory process. Can you just talk through that a little more? What is the pitfall? What are the things? What's the anti-pattern you've observed, and what are you trying to avoid with that issue?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, you're trying to avoid starvation of the subsequent process. So the preceding process will also have ups and downs and fluctuations for output, and as will the subsequent process. So when the subsequent process is doing well, it has to not get starved by the preceding process, just having a bad day. So that's where you have these buffers in between to build up buffer to handle those fluctuations, so you're not stopping the line. Having said that, you can't just leave 8 days of product sitting around. One, because they're, like I said, it's very moisture sensitive and there's contamination risks. And also it's very expensive to just have a space in your factory just for WIP. So there's a balance of how long can I store things and how long should I store things so my factory doesn't shut down.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting optimization problem because in theory, you can time everything perfectly so you have the exact right amount of material and product flowing through these processes. But as soon as one thing breaks down, if you've got no buffer in the system, then all of a sudden your production's basically shut down, and clearly something you want to avoid. Awesome. So with that, yeah, I'd love to move on to myths versus realities. And so these are based on in conversations with Kenzo, some things that he's seen and ways that people think about going through this process, this very involved and lengthy process that Kenzo just outlined. I'll make a statement, and then Kenzo and Tal, you can weigh in as to whether it's a myth or it's reality. So the first assertion is that lithium-ion battery manufacturing is a highly immature industry. It's all very new, and everyone's just trying to figure it out, and that's why this is so difficult, because it's just so new and unproven. Myth or reality?
I'll go Tal. I think it's a myth on some level. Take the example of the 18650 cylindrical. It was being manufactured 30 years ago, probably, and it is still being manufactured in one of the more common form factors in industry. So I don't know that something that's been made for 30 years that started at probably 20 parts per minute, and now we're processing it at the higher speeds of 600 parts per minute. To me, that's fairly mature.
Tal, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think in general, the industry has been around for a long time. The fundamental chemistries that are mass produced today were, as Kenzo said, for about 30 years, we've been producing them at this point. I think the immaturity of this industry does come to bear with a lot of the parts, the equipment manufacturers, the suppliers. This was a small business for a long time. Batteries, historically have totaled into the low, tens of billions in revenue annually. And because it was a small industry, you didn't really have the larger companies and larger industrialization efforts come up around that. And so the fundamental technology is actually relatively mature. I think the ecosystem around scaling it and ramping it up is still in its in the that teenage years, adolescence at this stage. So a lot of it is a myth, but there's parts of the industry that are still pretty immature at this stage.
Okay.
Yeah. To add to that, I would agree. Please. And at the beginning stages for process control, there's operators taking down data of how many cells did I make today. And the MES integration was not necessarily a thing in the beginning. It's slowly becoming more and more integrated. But now you have to move into the next industry 4.0 and that area of taking mass amounts of data, because you're making 600 parts per minute just on one line. So there is the immaturity around that, I think, still.
Interesting. I'll take that opportunity to dig in a little bit there. So what can you just say a little bit more about what trends you're seeing in sort of, so Kenzo just mentioned MES, that's manufacturing execution system, kind of the software that coordinates all the production, but you see that evolving towards this industry 4.0. Where do you think that there's what trends do you see, and where do you think the improvements might come as a result of that?
So the trend that I am seeing more and more is capturing a lot more data at each function, each process. So you have greater detailed traceability of what may have gone wrong. Where in the past it was something went wrong, you figured that out in formation and aging, and you went back and dug through, hopefully at least it was Excel files, or some database to try to determine and trace back and root cause something. Whereas now, all the PLCs are feeding up data to a cloud system or some other system. Hopefully that answers your question.
Indeed. I'm just curious, based on your experience, let's sort of rewind to before maybe people were taking so much data and doing this kind of analysis. What's sort of a typical range that you would see in terms of identifying an issue in production? How long would it take to go back upstream and find root cause? Just in rough terms, examples that you've seen from your experience.
Anywhere from an hour, but at the long end, 3 weeks, 3-4 weeks. Maybe.
Yeah, indeed. All right. Okay, so we've sort of established that the industry is kind of in its teenage years. It's definitely not completely immature, nascent industry, but nor is it entirely mature. But clearly, there are some big companies out there that have figured out how to do this and are doing it at scale and doing it profitably. So, myth or reality? There already is this large industry of mature players. We can just copy the playbook from Panasonic or LG Energy Solution or CATL or license what they do.
Sure, you can, but I don't. It's not that easy. Obviously, you can go buy the same equipment. You can license a cell, but just pushing the button and hoping cells spit out the other end is a little bit optimistic. So certainly a myth from my end.
Yeah, I think this comes to a common myth in the industry that there's this ability to essentially, copy and paste from one factory to another. Even for existing companies that are, internally, forget licensing or, transferring something over, there's just a lot of variability that happens from, factory to factory. There's, the equipment variability. There's new suppliers coming in for materials. There's even, I just remember talking with one of the large Asian cell suppliers, just even workforce variability. And so as they're spinning up workforces in different regions, different customs around working hours and things like that, and figuring out how to accommodate them. And so all of that subtle variability, it's not just plug and play at this stage. This is unstable production process that you're trying to keep operating effectively, and just trying to really figure out all those pieces live. It does require a lot of work for each and every factory that you bring up.
Indeed. So our next myth versus reality is specifically on suppliers for equipment, hardware, software. So there are a bunch of big gigafactories, most of which are in China, but there are some large companies that are operating gigafactories around the world. So that would suggest that there is a mature ecosystem of hardware and software vendors that are offering turnkey solutions for battery manufacturing. So what do we find there?
I touched on it in the presentation a little bit, but if somebody if I was building a gigafactory and somebody came to me and I said I have a turnkey solution, I wouldn't necessarily believe them, because of the complexities of each of the functional areas I alluded to in electrode and assembly, formation aging. Those are very different disciplines of putting down a slurry on a foil web versus forming a cell, having power electronics and the voltage measurement systems. So I would say it's a myth that it is turnkey. There are players coming out of China that have sort of a turnkey portfolio, but to me, there's weak points and strong points, and those weak points I wouldn't want to deal with.
And I think the other piece here is that there's a lot of ties into another, I think, myth that comes in the industry. Everyone tries to market that they have a drop-in solution that could just go into existing lithium-ion factory. Everything else is the same. We're just going to drop in this one component, and just all of those subtle variances create a lot of, if you don't understand the manufacturability, the process tolerances, really the boundaries around what the equipment needs to do and how to spec it, how it fits into the broader process, there's just a lot there to like figure out. And so, you have to work very closely with your equipment suppliers to really, and software providers to really tune the process to exactly what you're doing, and that whatever variability or changes you have made or were forced to make because of supply chain constraints and others. And so the industry is getting there. We're starting to see larger players and these portfolios of different tools come together. But we're still at the early stages of that turnkey solution being ready. And then the reality, as we talked about, is it's never going to be fully turnkey. There's always going to be some of that process optimization and really figuring things out on the ground.
Yeah, and just following up on that, Kenzo, as you outlined, a gigafactory is actually it's almost three different mini factories, each of which is doing very different types of things. There's the coating, the cell assembly, and then formation and aging or cell finishing. Among those three different areas, is there one that is more mature or one that's sort of developing and evolving fastest in terms of process technology, in terms of hardware? Where are things changing the fastest and where are things kind of the most mature and stable?
Mature, that's a hard one. Mature and stable, I think it's the converting side of it, but it's also the hardest side of it. So the electrodes, the coating and the mixing and the calendaring, that happens in other industries a lot. But it is also this black art that exists that people struggle mightily with. And the advice I give to some startups is, for the first several years, do not even try to coat. Go buy electrodes if you can, because it'll be the reason for your failure. To answer your question, I think a lot of the innovation is happening in the parts assembly, the component assembly, with different form factors and sizes and tolerances. There's more vision systems and things on the line that help things go faster and help things get monitored and qualified in real time.
Interesting. And so, for, let's say when you engage with a startup that's moving towards mass production, just what do you advise in terms of evaluating and identifying equipment suppliers? How do you go about it? How do you make sure you end up with equipment that can do the job? Is it like a price optimization kind of thing? Is it based on capability? Is it future flexibility to adapt to evolution? And what are the kind of key factors in the decision in looking for equipment suppliers to outfit a large scale production facility?
More often than not, it's driven by cost and lead time, which is to me not the right items to focus on. But I mean, for the survival of these companies, sometimes that's the only one they can hone in around. But if money and time were not factors, there are companies that are well known out there to provide, say, for example, the best coder. But that's right now it's a 2 to 3 year lead time. And can a company survive that long without a coder? So that becomes sort of the senior management decision of what to do and where to have shortcuts, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. And you also you talked about how just commissioning, you have to commission each separate piece of equipment individually. Can you just talk through, just pick an example of a piece of equipment and what into a little bit more detail, like what is that commissioning process like? What do you actually do? Who's involved and what's going on?
Or I'll take the coder as an example. Once you make an electrode, there are certain things you can measure in real time or at line or offline to give you an indication of the quality. But ultimately, you have to create a cell from that coated electrode and cycle it and get performance results out of it. And that's what's one of the reasons it takes so much time, is that feedback loop of making a cell with perhaps the coder that's not quite ready, and all your subsequent equipment is maybe not even quite ready yet. So you've made this questionable cell, and now you have to measure it for cycling performance or safety performance, and that is an interpretation of data that is tricky and time consuming.
Indeed. So I'm gonna go to another statement that we'll talk about, myth versus reality. This is one I personally have heard. I've been in the room when this sort of question is asked. So if I'm getting ready to set up, like, let's say, a pilot line or even full production, I can just copy someone else's control plan, basically, the handbook and all the different pieces of equipment and how you run them and what your starting set points are to get started. I can just copy someone else's plan and use that as a starting point. Myth or reality?
I don't know if that's completely wrong to use it as a starting point, but I would hopefully come up with my own that is based on your process and based on your product. There's a lot of specifics that you have to integrate into a control plan that can't just be from a template that you found somewhere. So certainly, I think it's mostly myth.
Indeed, and I'll go to one more, and then we'll go to some wrap-up comments before we get to the Q&A. So again, you sort of alluded to this, but myth or reality? I can shortcut by ramping up prototype, pilot, and production in parallel, or even skip one or more of the stages, and end up with a successful factory.
That, to me, that's a complete myth, and I hope people don't do that. Unfortunately, I've seen companies that have tried that and done that and failed or continue to struggle by skipping pilot, going from what you call A sample right to C sample, sort of in automotive terms, but from hand making to making millions a day. There is certainly an in-between with a lot of learning and a lot of adjustments you have to have, and a lot of information that you have to put into the equipment design for your product and your processes. So I would say that's a very big myth.
Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, you do see companies that are attempting to skip over that crucial pilot stage. Can you just say more about what is it that you learn? So, like, you've got smart people, you've proven out that you can make a handful of pieces at a time, and for sure that once you dial in full production, you're going to have a good product. So what is so important about that middle stage, that pilot stage, for eventual success?
That pilot stage, like I had in some of the bullet points, you're buying equipment with a lot of knobs and levers. So you figure out your process windows, your process parameters, and some of your equipment capabilities as far as tolerancing. And to not have that information and go buy a piece of equipment that for mass production, it is where there's mistakes made. Cost is one of them. You're over engineering your mass production equipment to have these large process windows, and at the end of the day, it cannot do potentially the window that you want because you don't have the information. You didn't have the information when you specified that equipment. So you're struggling to use this very expensive mass production equipment at process parameters that weren't developed properly, and the battery making is the margins are super low, the yields have to be super high, and the barriers to entry are very expensive. So there are steps you need to make to make sure you are, like I said, profitable or making money in mass production.
Yeah, and going back to that just coating example, and between that, like, materials to the coats, and just thinking about the process variability from a coater you're running at a lab scale going at a relatively slow rate to many meters per minute, or hundreds or more. You have to think about the materials and, like, just the mechanical, like just properties of that coat as it's going through a much faster process. Think about the densities, think about, the new materials lots. Instead of getting smaller bags of materials, you're now getting truckloads, and that variability of your slurry and viscosity and all those underlying components. There's a lot of subtle variation there that you don't want to figure out when you're putting hundreds of thousands of dollars of material into a larger mix and coat process, and then waiting, you may have done 3 weeks of that before you realize there's a problem. All of a sudden you're millions of dollars in the hole. And so trying to figure those things out earlier at a smaller scale just pays for itself many times over. And it becomes a very expensive proposition, especially that figuring out those feedback loops. This fundamental challenge around batteries is a lot of these underlying things in the materials, the coating densities and things like that. You may be able to catch them early on in QC, but often you don't know what to look for. And if you're stuck waiting weeks or months for a larger aging study to happen on these cells, you may be set back months or more than that, many millions of dollars potentially if you go straight to the larger scale here. So it's really important to try to dial things out in some sort of smaller scale as much as you can. There's always going to be some variability as you scale up. That's natural there, but try to dial in as much of that as you can at a cheaper, smaller scale.
Indeed.
Agreed.
So, anything else to add there, Kenzo?
No, I agree with Tulsa for sure.
Excellent. Great. So before we move on to the Q&A, I'd just like to ask kind of one wrap-up question. So, I think we've firmly established that there are really no shortcuts. You got to do the work. You got to put in, listen to your product people, get things dialed in at each stage, and you really can't skip or shortcut. So, given all of that, there's tremendous urgency in terms of market demand. There's also financial considerations in terms of the amount of cash you're burning along the way. So, if there are no shortcuts, what are the keys to just moving through this process as quickly as possible? It'd be great if time and money were not considerations, but they are clearly. So, what do you advise in practical terms for being smart about moving through this process as quickly as possible?
It's a good question. So I think learning from mistakes. I think it sounds super cliche and simple, but I'm definitely seeing companies, big and small, that don't learn from their mistakes or apply those learnings to the next phase or the next iteration or the next version of whether it's your product or your process. So how do you do that is, I think, making sure each of the iterations or steps you take are well planned and results are well recorded, and those results are used for the next version of what you're trying to do. So I know it sounds a little bit simplistic, but definitely using lessons learned, tracking lessons learned, and applying them to their next stages is super, super, super vital. And it's missed a lot.
100%. And, that's really the goal of what we're trying to do at Voltaic, is really create this data-driven infrastructure. But it even starts before you bring in, software tools like ours to collect and build this learning attitude. It's also just building in place the processes, making sure you have, the data that can be recorded off the equipment, and it's trying to skip that piece of measurement equipment in your process may leave you blind. And so just making sure you fundamentally are able to purchase equipment with the right levels of data collection. You don't want to go overboard because the margins are thin here in the battery space, but having that data and then building a culture of centralizing that data and learning from it actively is really the key here. Because even once you do get to scaled production, there's always going to be something that's going to try to throw you off line. And so it's going to be a lot of material that comes in that's a little bit different. Is that okay? What do we do with that? Do we send it back? That could create a OEE bottleneck, and you're going to have to start making those decisions actively on the fly, even once you do get to scaled production. And so that system of learning is important, not just during scale up, but also just overall, just running that factory.
Awesome. Anything else to add there, Kenzo?
Yeah, maybe a little bit. When your factory is scaling up, there's always, non-conformances, excursions of something that goes wrong. And to deal with those excursions is I think the incumbents have sort of references to do or to take on how you handle a batch that had this excursion. Whereas the newcomers are, this is unknown, let's just scrap it, which is something probably the right decision a lot of times. But building that reference library of how to handle excursions and nonconformances, like Tal said, sending it back to a previous process, having that, blowing up that reference library is something that you have to do from day one.
Excellent. I love that because it flows right into what I had my eye on as one of the first questions for Q&A. So the question that came in from our audience is, do you think there's a difference in the challenges faced by the big players like Samsung, LG, SK, Panasonic, Tesla, and the many startups that have sprung up in the US and Europe are the ones we're hearing about primarily? So you just outlined one, which is that the incumbents have years of experience. They've built up a library of if A, then B. When this, goes wrong or gets weird, here's how we respond. And the newbies, let's say, don't have that benefit. But can you talk about some other differences in the challenges that the startup, aspiring gigafactory players face relative to the more established competition?
One of them that we touched on a little bit is procuring the right equipment. When a startup, they may not have the procurement team that's seasoned and that's been around and bought certain equipment over and over from a certain vendor. So they have to, believe what's told by maybe a salesperson pitching something that's super low cost and super low lead time or quick lead time. And that's, of course, is certainly appealing to a startup. And I think those are some of the differences. Some of these startups can't go to the big vendors and ask for one tool. A lot of the capacity is taken up by the incumbents. So I think there's a difference there in being able to source and choose the right equipment and equipment vendors.
Yeah, I think you have that one. And I think, procurement teams are very important when it comes to that, just getting the right equipment, knowing where to push suppliers, where you can cut some corners and don't need that extra, piece of sensitivity in certain areas. And very important to work very closely with the process teams. And that requires some insight on knowing, requires a bit of a well-oiled internal machine there. But yeah, once you get the equipment, you just got to figure it out. And so there's a part of that that everyone has to do, but the incumbents do have a leg up there. And then, you sort of be surprised even with the incumbents that, reference library, it often isn't actually very well documented, even at the incumbents. And a lot of it lives in the personnel that's at these factories. And, for those of us who've been around the battery space, we know, go into these mostly guys who are there who know exactly how the slurry is supposed to look. And, even if the equipment says it's good, they'll tell you, something's not quite right, leave it in there a couple extra minutes and so a lot of that know-how, this is, I think, just speaks to the still immaturity in the space is as we scale up, that was fine when you had all of your factories, in Korea or Japan or China. But now as people are scaling up factories around the globe, that one guy can't be there across all the other factories. And there's this needed maturity of building up these digital infrastructures and reference libraries and that learning into an organizational system that companies could utilize. So yeah, even though the incumbents do have a leg up in a number of ways, they're still relatively immature, I think, as far as, figuring out that next stage, especially for global expansion at a much larger scale and pace than we've seen before.
That leads really nicely into another question that I had my eye on from the audience. So how much of the time schedule and ramp up, how much improvement do you see if you're trying to duplicate a cell that has mature mass production already, copying the master production line into a new facility? So this gets kind of the we talked a little bit about, copy paste. Tal, you presented that as a fallacy. A lot of us are familiar with models from semiconductor manufacturing with a kind of copy exact methodology where you had Intel building, factories identically around the world down to the color of paint on the railings and things like that. So yeah, could you talk a little bit more, Kenzo, in your experience about, if you have any sort of guidelines or rules of thumb of how much less time it takes to copy a mature technology, if at all, and just kind of talk a little bit more about the difference between developing a new production process versus reproducing an already successful production process.
Okay, that's a lot. So for an example, let's just say there is a gigafactory in Nevada that is essentially a copy paste of what was happening in Japan. And some of the advantages of that scenario was one could get electrodes from Japan and sent to the gigafactory in the US and accelerate, ultimately the factory output, but a lot of the commissioning, because you need to essentially, use the electrodes only to debug a machine, so they become scrap. So you are wasting a lot of what is a lot of times good electrodes because you want good electrodes to test your machines. So that is certainly an element that was helpful in a copy paste situation. But at the same time, that company sent 400 engineers over to start this facility, and I don't know that everybody can send 400 engineers to start up a gigafactory. So yeah, copy paste works. The equipment had to look quite different actually for regulatory reasons, so it wasn't exactly copy and paste. There was some relearning that had to be done. I
think you hit on a key part to that is like there is no exact copy paste, especially when you're transferring internationally, and so that factory, notably took about 4 years until they announced they finally hit profitability from start of production when they started making cells. And so even with that copy and paste scenario, you're going faster, you have slight changes in equipment, you have new materials suppliers starting to come online, new personnel. I think the one place where we have seen a copy and paste like really do well is if you look at within a smaller geography. So like CATL is probably the best example of spinning up lots of very similar factories and doing that relatively successfully compared to others. But they have the benefit of large domestic workforce that they're able to move around between factories. They have that equipment supply base that is ready to go for that domestic market. But as soon as you start expanding geographies, changing regulatory changes and things like that, it starts changing. And I think the other evolution here is just about all factories, you're not going to be making 5-year-old technology. You do want to improve your costs, improve your performance, and as part of that, it's no longer a copy and paste. You have some slight changes in chemistry, you have changes in the design of your cells, and there is this continuous evolution that's happening that, even though you're trying to keep things the same, there's still some evolution that you do need to accommodate for.
Excellent. So we have time for one final question, which did come in from the audience. So, we hear, of course, at Voltaic, we're a software company. We also have a lot of expertise and folks that can engage with customers around that expertise. But fundamentally, we exist as a software company to try and help accelerate the industry. And in software, all you're hearing about these days is, these days it's all AI, artificial intelligence. Machine learning is almost passé. But I'm wondering what you've seen, Kenzo, actually on the ground at factories, at where is ML being used, machine learning and artificial intelligence being used today, if at all, and where do you see potential for application of these sort of advanced computational technologies beyond just collecting data and driving these correlations more quickly?
So beyond that, I haven't seen it in the factory setting. Where I've seen some ML is cycle life prediction of the cells that come off the line, but no. Other than that, at least from what I've seen and been around, AI and ML aren't applied in the factory setting.
Yeah, the reality is most ML and AI that's marketed in the industry today is, POCs on small samples of data that was extracted from a factory months ago and isn't actually applied in line. I think we're starting to see within individual process steps what people are calling ML and AI, but a lot of those are basic statistical techniques or regressions and things like that are running. One of the areas that we're really focusing on at Voltaic is really anomaly detection and early identification of issues. End of line, once you make that full cell, try not to wait that weeks until figuring out if it's good or bad. Can you identify that within the first few hours? And seeing a lot of success there. But as far as large scale deployment of the technology, it's still mostly marketing at this stage, what we're seeing in the industry.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway on that note is, there's definitely some promise in the future, but as far as, any sort of vendor that's out there telling you that AI and ML is going to solve all your problems, you really just don't believe the hype. You have to do your homework. You have to do all the things that Kenzo just talked about of institutionalizing the learning, record the data, learn from that data, don't make the same mistakes.
Build a software infrastructure that allows you to utilize these technologies. It's the fundamental building blocks are still missing in a lot of companies to enable real-time ML and AI.
Yeah, for better or for worse, AI and ML are not your shortcut. You still got to do the work. So with that, we're out of time, and I want to say thanks again to our panelists. And of course, we welcome further interaction from the audience. You're always welcome to email us at info@voltaic.com. And as something we mentioned earlier on, is at Voltaic we now have this EBIX consulting practice. So EBI is Enterprise Battery Intelligence, and EBIX is what's helping us take customers to the next level through engagement with experts like Kenzo and many others that are in our network. So we look forward to hearing from you, and thanks again for joining our webinar, and we'll be seeing you again. Stay tuned for future webinars on battery manufacturing. Thanks very much.
Thanks all.
Thanks all. Thank you.